Lyra, an alien girl from the planet Zoreth-7, had always been curious about her world's past. From the moment she could walk, she had listened to the elders tell stories of ancient times. The most exciting of these tales was the one about a legendary blacksmith, a being who had crafted a sword that was said to possess unimaginable power. The sword, according to the stories, had been lost to time, hidden somewhere on their planet. Many believed it was just a myth, a story passed down for generations, but Lyra couldn't help but feel that there was more to it. For years, she had studied maps, read ancient texts, and asked the elders about the sword. One day, while exploring the dense forest near her home, she stumbled upon something unexpected: an entrance to a hidden cave. It was cleverly concealed behind thick vines and towering trees. At first, Lyra thought it was just another rock formation, but something about it felt different. Her instincts told her this was no ordinary place. With a heart full of excitement and a bit of fear, she pushed aside the vines and stepped closer to the cave's entrance. The air felt strangely charged, as though something ancient and powerful was waiting for her inside. Lyra hesitated for a moment. Was this truly the place spoken of in the stories? Her breath quickened with anticipation as she ventured deeper into the cave. The further she walked, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The ground beneath her feet was smooth, and the walls of the cave were lined with strange symbols. They glowed faintly, lighting her way as if the cave itself was alive, guiding her toward something important. Lyra could feel her heartbeat in her chest, louder than ever, as though the very cave was aware of her presence. Soon, she came across something that took her breath away: a large stone pedestal on which rested a sword. The sword was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its blade shimmered in the dim light, a faint glow surrounding it as if it were alive. The hilt was crafted from a metal that seemed to shift colors, reflecting the soft glow of the cave's walls. Around the sword were intricate designs, symbols that Lyra recognized from the old texts she had studied. They were the markings of the ancient blacksmith. Lyra's hands trembled as she stepped forward. She had found it, the sword of the legendary blacksmith. It was real. It was here, hidden away in this forgotten cave. But as her fingers brushed against the hilt, something unexpected happened. The air around her grew heavy, and a deep hum filled the cave. The sword seemed to react to her touch, as if it had been waiting for her all this time. A sharp, bright light suddenly erupted from the sword's blade, illuminating the cave in a flash. Lyra instinctively pulled her hand away, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the intense light. When the light finally dimmed, the sword was no longer embedded in the stone pedestal. It floated gently in the air, as though it were alive, calling to her. Lyra reached out again, this time more cautiously. As her fingers wrapped around the hilt, she felt a powerful energy surge through her body. The sword, it seemed, had chosen her. She could feel its weight, but it was not heavy. Rather, it felt like an extension of herself, as though it belonged to her. Lyra could hear a voice, faint at first, whispering in her mind. It was ancient, speaking in a language she couldn't understand, but somehow she knew what it meant. The sword had a purpose, and it had chosen her to fulfill it. She turned the sword over in her hands, examining it from every angle. The blade was flawless, sharper than any weapon she had ever seen. The symbols along the hilt began to glow brighter, as if the sword itself was awakening. It was no longer just an artifact of legend. It was a living thing, a weapon of immense power, and it had bound itself to Lyra. But what now? What was she supposed to do with this powerful weapon? The cave, which had once been quiet and still, now hummed with energy. Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that her discovery was no coincidence. This sword, this ancient power, was meant for something greater. But she had no idea what that something was. As she stood in the cave, the sword pulsing gently in her hands, Lyra felt a wave of uncertainty. The stories spoke of the blacksmith's weapon being the key to something much bigger, something that could change the fate of her people. But what if she wasn't ready? What if she wasn't strong enough to wield such power? The questions filled her mind, but one thing was certain. This sword had chosen her for a reason. And no matter what the future held, Lyra knew that she was now part of something far greater than herself. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but she had the sword, the key to her destiny. With renewed determination, Lyra made her decision. She would learn the sword's true purpose, and she would protect it from anyone who sought to misuse its power. The adventure had only just begun, and Lyra was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As Lyra held the sword in her hands, a sense of awe washed over her. The power that radiated from it was unlike anything she had ever felt before. It was not just the weight of the blade. It was the energy coursing through her, filling her body with strength and purpose. The sword seemed to call to her, like a silent voice speaking deep inside her mind. The symbols on the hilt glowed brighter, their meaning suddenly clear to her. The voice that spoke within her was ancient, yet strangely familiar, as though it had always been there, waiting for her to listen. "The time has come, Lyra," it whispered. "You are the one who will awaken the true power of this sword. You must be prepared, for the path ahead is not easy." Lyra's heart raced as she tried to understand the message. She had always known that the sword was special, but this feeling, this overwhelming energy, was something entirely different. She felt as if she had unlocked a door to a power she had never imagined possible. The sword was more than just a weapon. It was a tool, a key to something much larger. The glow from the sword's hilt pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, as though it was attuned to her very essence. Lyra took a deep breath, feeling a strange connection to the sword. It felt like an extension of herself, as though she had always been meant to wield it. The cave around her seemed to respond to the energy, the walls vibrating faintly as if they too recognized the awakening of the blade's power. With a sense of determination, Lyra gripped the sword tightly. The moment she did, the sword's blade shimmered with an otherworldly light, and she could feel the flow of energy shifting inside her. The blade hummed, and the power within her surged, causing the air around her to crackle. She lifted the sword, and it felt weightless, almost like it was guiding her movements. Every swing of the blade felt natural, as if it had been trained in her hands her whole life. The symbols on the hilt began to shift, rearranging themselves as if they were alive, telling her something that was just out of reach. Lyra closed her eyes, letting the sword guide her. In that moment, she understood. The sword was more than just a weapon for battle. It was a force of nature, a symbol of balance, created to protect and preserve the harmony of the universe. It had been forged in the heart of the galaxy by a master blacksmith who had unlocked the secrets of energy itself. Now, it had chosen Lyra to continue its legacy. The sword's power did not just lie in its sharp blade or the glowing symbols on its hilt. It was in the connection it formed with its wielder. Lyra realized that she could tap into the energy within the sword, using it to manipulate the very elements around her. She raised the blade high, and in response, the air around her seemed to bend. The ground beneath her feet cracked open as a surge of energy shot from the sword, forming a protective shield around her. She felt an overwhelming sense of control, as if she could shape the world with just a thought. For a moment, Lyra stood there, amazed by what she had just done. The sword had responded to her, and she had used its power instinctively, as though she had been training for this moment her entire life. The energy within her swirled, calm yet intense, and she knew that she had only scratched the surface of what the sword was capable of. There was still so much more to discover. But with this newfound power came responsibility. Lyra knew that the sword was not just a gift. It was a weapon, one that could either protect or destroy. The ancient blacksmith had crafted it for a reason, and Lyra understood that she had to be careful with it. This power could change the course of her planet's future, and she had to decide how to use it wisely. The voice inside her spoke again, clearer this time. "The sword has chosen you, Lyra, but its power comes with a burden. You must decide what kind of protector you will be. Will you wield this sword for the greater good, or will you let its power consume you?" Lyra stood still, contemplating the weight of the words. She had always dreamed of adventure, of becoming something more than just a simple girl from a small village. Now, she had the sword, the power to shape the future, but with it came the responsibility of making difficult choices. She knew that the path ahead would not be easy. There would be dangers, temptations, and challenges that would test her every step of the way. But in that moment, Lyra made a vow to herself. She would not let the sword's power control her. She would be the protector it had been forged to be. She would learn to master its abilities and use them to defend her people, to protect her planet, and to ensure that the legacy of the legendary blacksmith lived on. With newfound resolve, Lyra lowered the sword and took a deep breath. She had a long journey ahead of her, but she was ready. The sword had chosen her for a reason, and she would not let it down. The true test of her strength had only just begun. Lyra stood in the heart of the cave, still holding the legendary sword. The soft glow from its hilt illuminated the walls around her, casting strange shadows. Despite the power that flowed through her, a part of her still felt uncertain. What was her next step? How would she learn to control the sword's immense power? The voice that had spoken to her before remained silent now, leaving her with nothing but her thoughts and the weight of her newfound responsibility. As she stood there, her ears picked up a strange sound. It was faint at first, like a low hum, almost a vibration in the air. Lyra's instincts told her something was wrong, and she immediately gripped the sword tighter, ready for anything. The hum grew louder, followed by the distant rumble of something crashing. The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, as though something large had landed nearby. Lyra's curiosity took over. She moved swiftly through the cave, carefully stepping over rocks and uneven ground. The sound seemed to be coming from outside, beyond the cave's entrance. She pushed aside the vines and stepped into the open air. The sky above was a deep purple, the stars already beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. What she saw next took her by surprise. A strange, metallic craft had crashed in the distance, sending plumes of dust into the air. The ship was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen before. It was sleek, with smooth silver panels and an unusual design. It seemed damaged, its engine sputtering, but it was still intact. A soft, bluish light flickered from within. Lyra's heart raced. She had never seen anything from beyond Zoreth 7 before. Was it an enemy, or perhaps a traveler like herself? Curiosity overpowered her caution. She ran toward the crash site, her feet kicking up dirt as she sped across the terrain. As she approached, she saw movement from within the wreckage. A figure, hunched over and struggling, crawled out from the wrecked ship. Lyra slowed down, unsure whether to approach or stay hidden. The figure seemed human, tall, with dark brown hair and wearing strange clothes. He was groaning softly, clearly injured but alive. Lyra hesitated for a moment, but then her instincts kicked in. She couldn't just leave him there. She stepped forward cautiously, calling out to him. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice a bit shaky but firm. The human, startled, turned to face her. His eyes were wide with surprise, and for a moment, he seemed to question whether she was real. I think so," the man replied, his voice strained. "I'm Captain Ethan Armitage of the Human Explorer Fleet. I crashed. Looks like my ship's done for." Lyra studied him carefully. His accent was unfamiliar, but the words he spoke were clear. This human, like the ones in the old stories, was from another world. She had heard of humans before, legendary explorers from across the galaxy, but had never actually met one. She had only imagined what they might look like. Now, here was one, standing right in front of her, clearly injured and in need of help. "I'm Lyra," she said, her voice softening. "You're safe now. I'll help you." Captain Armitage seemed to relax a little at her words, though he was still struggling to stand. "Thank you," he said with a slight smile. "I don't know how I ended up on this planet. My ship was damaged during a skirmish with some hostile forces. I wasn't sure if I'd make it. Lyra knelt beside him, noticing the way his hand trembled as he leaned on her for support. He wasn't just hurt. He was exhausted, drained from the crash and the crash landing. Without thinking, she lifted her sword slightly, letting its glow brighten the area around them. The energy from the blade seemed to give her strength, and she placed a hand on the human's shoulder, helping him to his feet. "Can you walk?" she asked, her tone more concerned than before. Ethan nodded slowly, though his legs wobbled beneath him. "I can manage, I think, but I'm not going to be much help for a while." He looked at the sword in her hand, his eyes filled with both curiosity and amazement. "What is that?" It looks ancient and powerful." Lyra hesitated for a moment, her fingers curling around the hilt of the sword. She didn't want to overwhelm him with the truth. He was a stranger, and even though she felt a strange bond between them, she wasn't sure if she could trust him completely. But something about the way he looked at the sword, almost reverently, told her that he wasn't here to harm her or take it. "This sword is something I found. It's part of an old legend," she explained carefully. "It's said to have great power, but I don't fully understand it yet. I'm still learning." Ethan nodded slowly, clearly intrigued but too tired to ask more questions. "I'm just trying to survive right now." "It looks like you've got your own challenges to deal with." His gaze grew serious, and for the first time, he seemed to notice the quiet tension in the air. "The forces that attacked my ship." Ethan paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They'll be coming for me. They won't stop until they find me." Lyra felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know who had attacked the human ship, but the look on his face was enough to tell her that danger was near. She could feel it, the same feeling she had when she first touched the sword. This was no ordinary human. This was someone who had been pursued across the stars, and now she was somehow involved in his fight. The night air seemed to grow colder, and Lyra realized that her journey had just taken an unexpected turn. Lyra helped Captain Ethan Armitage to his feet, supporting him as they began to walk. The weight of the situation was beginning to settle in. She had never expected her discovery of the legendary sword to lead to a meeting with a human, let alone one who was being chased by dangerous forces. Ethan was clearly in no condition to fight, his strength failing him after the crash, and Lyra knew that she would need to protect him. They moved cautiously through the dense forest, the glowing sword in Lyra's hand casting a faint light ahead of them. Every step felt heavier, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She had no idea what kind of enemies Ethan had made, but the fear in his eyes was enough to make her take the threat seriously. She could feel the sword's power humming gently, as if sensing the danger that loomed. "We need to find shelter," Lyra said, glancing over at Ethan. "You need to rest." Ethan nodded, his face pale and sweat beading on his forehead. "I'm not sure how long I can keep moving," he admitted. "Those forces, they're relentless. I've been running from them for days." Lyra could feel the tension in his voice. The enemies he spoke of were not just a small group of soldiers. They were something bigger, something that had been hunting him across the stars. It wasn't just a simple chase. It was a war, and Ethan was caught right in the middle of it. She had no idea who these enemies were, but one thing was clear. If they were after him, they would stop at nothing to capture or destroy him. "There's a cave nearby," Lyra said, her voice steady as she tried to think quickly. "It's hidden, and no one should find us there." Ethan looked at her, his expression filled with gratitude and a touch of disbelief. "You know this place?" Lyra nodded. "I've explored these forests before. We should be safe there for now." As they made their way through the trees, Lyra couldn't help but wonder about the forces Ethan had angered. Who were they? What did they want with him? And most importantly, why had they come to Zorith 7? Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, they reached the cave. Lyra led Ethan inside, where the cool, damp air greeted them with relief. She quickly helped him settle against the back of the cave, his breathing still shallow from exhaustion. The glow of the sword illuminated the dark space around them, casting long shadows across the walls. Ethan sank into the cave's corner, his eyes closing as he tried to catch his breath. "Thank you," he said weakly. "I didn't think I'd make it this far." Lyra sat down beside him, her mind racing. She had so many questions, but now was not the time to ask. Instead, she focused on keeping them safe. The sword hummed softly in her hands, its energy reassuring. She couldn't explain it, but it felt as though the sword was watching over them, guiding her in the right direction. "I won't let them find us," Lyra said firmly, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "You're safe here." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with exhaustion, but also a sense of relief. "I don't know what you're capable of, but I'm starting to believe you might just be my only hope." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. His words were heavy with meaning, and she could feel the weight of his trust beginning to build between them. She didn't know what had brought her to this moment, but something told her that she was meant to help him. They were connected, no matter how unlikely their meeting had been. And now, she had to protect him. "We'll figure this out," Lyra said, her voice softer now. "But we need to rest. You've been through a lot, and I don't know what's coming, but I'll be ready." Ethan nodded, closing his eyes once more. "I've seen a lot of things in my time, but this is different. I don't know what's worse, the enemies chasing me, or the fact that I don't know who to trust anymore." Lyra frowned, her thoughts darkening. She could understand his fear. After all, she had never been in a situation like this before either. The enemies Ethan had mentioned were dangerous. That much was clear. But she also knew that they were not going to stop. They would come for him. And it was only a matter of time before they found him. Unless they could move quickly, unless they had a plan. "I think I know where they're headed," Ethan said suddenly, his eyes widening as he remembered something. "There's a place, an ancient site on this planet. It's a ruin, and it's connected to the old stories. If they find it, they'll have all the power they need. We can't let them reach it." Lyra looked at him, her mind whirling. An ancient site. It sounded like the ruin where the sword had been forged, the place where the blacksmith had created the weapon. If Ethan's enemies were headed there, it could mean that they were after something even more dangerous than just him. "You're right," Lyra said, her voice filled with determination. "We need to get there first. We can't let them take it." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing with focus. "Then we have no time to waste. We have to move, and fast." Lyra gripped the sword tightly. The battle was far from over, and now it was clear. The true fight had only just begun. Together, they would face whatever dangers lay ahead. But she knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, she would not let them fall into the wrong hands. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cave entrance, painting the walls with a soft, golden glow. Lyra had barely slept. Her mind had been racing with thoughts of the journey ahead, of the enemies that were surely hunting them, and of the ancient site that Ethan had spoken about. It was clear that the time for hiding was over. They had to move. Fast. Ethan had rested as best as he could, though he was still weak from the crash and the journey he had endured. Lyra could see the exhaustion in his eyes, but there was a fire there too, a determination. He was not going to give up. She admired that about him. There was something in his spirit that reminded her of herself. No matter how dire the situation seemed, he was going to keep fighting. After a quick meal of ration packs from Ethan's emergency supplies, they set out. Lyra led the way, her sword glowing faintly as it hung at her side. The sword seemed to guide her movements, a constant reminder of the power she now held, and the responsibility that came with it. She had a feeling that the journey to the ancient ruins would be dangerous, but she was ready. With Ethan by her side, she knew they had a fighting chance. The terrain around them was dense with thick trees and tangled vines. The forest of Zoreth 7 was beautiful, but it was also treacherous. Strange creatures roamed the shadows, and the air was thick with the sounds of unseen life. Lyra kept her senses sharp, listening for any unusual sounds or movements. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made her heart race. She couldn't afford to be careless. As they moved deeper into the forest, Ithan spoke again, his voice low but serious. "The ancient site I'm talking about, it's more than just a ruin. It's a place of great power, a place that can shape the future of entire worlds. The enemy I'm running from, they want that power, and they won't stop until they have it." Lyra glanced back at him, her brow furrowing. "What kind of power are we talking about? What makes this place so special?" Ithan hesitated for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. The ancient civilization that built it, before they disappeared, had knowledge that no one else possessed. They had the ability to manipulate energy, to control the forces of nature itself. The ruins hold their secrets, and whoever unlocks them will have the ability to reshape entire galaxies. Lyra's grip tightened on the sword as she processed his words. This was bigger than she had imagined. If the enemies were after that power, they could destroy everything. Planets, civilizations, entire systems. The stakes had never been higher. She could feel the weight of the sword beside her, as if it was reminding her that this battle wasn't just about survival. It was about preserving the balance of the universe. The path grew steeper as they climbed toward the heart of the forest. The trees seemed to grow taller, their branches twisting high above them, like a canopy of ancient arms. Lyra could feel a strange pull, as though the land itself was guiding them. The energy from the sword seemed to grow stronger the closer they got to the ruins, and she could sense that they were nearing their destination. After hours of travel, they reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing, partially hidden by vines and moss, lay the entrance to an underground structure. The stone archway was carved with intricate symbols that Lyra didn't recognize. Some of the markings resembled the symbols on the sword's hilt, but they were much older, worn with time. "This is it," Ithan said, his voice filled with awe and apprehension. "The entrance to the ruins." Lyra stepped forward cautiously, her sword raised slightly. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she was ready for anything. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, and she could feel the ground beneath her feet vibrating faintly. The ruins were alive with power, ancient power that had been dormant for centuries, waiting for someone to awaken it. Ithan moved beside her, his expression tense. "We don't have much time. The enemy is close." Lyra nodded, her mind focused. They couldn't waste any more time. She reached out, brushing aside the thick vines that covered the entrance. As soon as she did, the ground beneath them trembled, and the symbols on the archway began to glow faintly. The ancient structure was responding to her presence. She could feel the sword's energy merging with the energy of the ruins, as if they were connected in some way. With a deep breath, Lyra stepped into the darkness of the ruins, followed closely by Ithan. The air inside was cool and damp, and the walls were lined with strange, glowing crystals. The light from the sword flickered and pulsed, illuminating the vast, cavernous space around them. The architecture was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen. Columns stretched high into the darkness, their surfaces carved with more symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "This place is incredible," Ithan whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Lyra didn't have time to marvel at the ruins. She was already searching for something, anything, that would give them an advantage against the forces that were surely closing in on them. The deeper they went into the ruins, the more intense the energy became. It was as if the very walls were alive, resonating with a power that was both beautiful and terrifying. "Stay close," Lyra said softly to Ithan, her eyes scanning the surroundings. She wasn't sure what kind of traps or dangers lay ahead, but she wasn't about to take any chances. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she stayed calm. The sword was more than just a weapon. It was her guide, her connection to this ancient power, and she would need all of its strength to protect them. Just as they reached the center of the ruins, a distant sound reached their ears, a a low, echoing hum, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. The enemy had found them. "We're not alone," she whispered to Ethan, her grip tightening around the sword's hilt. The fight for their survival was about to begin. The air in the ancient ruins seemed to grow heavier as the sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber. Lyra's senses were on high alert, every nerve in her body primed for action. She could feel the sword pulsing gently in her hand, its energy mirroring the tension in the air. Ethan, standing beside her, had his eyes wide with fear and determination. The enemy had found them, and there was no time left for second guesses. "We need to move," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. She glanced around, searching for an escape route. The vast chamber stretched before them, filled with strange carvings and glowing crystals. It felt like they were standing at the center of an ancient power, and the weight of it pressed down on her shoulders. But there was no time to admire the ruins now. They had to find a way to fight back, or at the very least, escape before it was too late. Ethan nodded, his face tense. "Where do we go?" Lyra's eyes darted to the far side of the chamber, where a narrow passageway led deeper into the ruins. She could see that it was dark, but it seemed to offer a possible route. The hum of the enemy's presence grew louder, and Lyra felt the sword's energy surge through her, urging her forward. "This way," she said firmly, moving toward the passage. She reached out, gripping Ethan's arm gently but firmly, guiding him behind her. The footsteps of their pursuers were getting closer now, the ground vibrating faintly with their approach. Lyra's mind raced. She needed to make a decision. The enemy wouldn't just stop at the entrance. They would know the ruins' layout and be able to track them down. There was only one way to stop them. "Ethan," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the rising panic. "You have to trust me. I think I know how to activate the ruins. I think I can use the sword to open a way to the next chamber. It's our best shot." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and hope. "You can do that. Activate the ruins." Lyra nodded, her grip tightening on the sword. "I can feel the power in the sword. It's like it's connected to this place. If I can channel it, maybe I can unlock something that will keep them from following us." With no time to waste, Lyra moved quickly toward the center of the room, where the energy seemed to be the strongest. She placed her hand on one of the glowing crystals, and the sword hummed louder in response. She closed her eyes and focused, trying to tune herself into the rhythm of the ruins. She could feel the energy in the stone, ancient and powerful, almost as if it were alive. The sword, too, seemed to resonate with it, as if guiding her. For a moment, nothing happened. Lyra's heart raced, her breath shallow. Had she made a mistake? Could she really activate the ruins? The enemy was close now, their footsteps echoing louder and louder. She couldn't fail. She wouldn't fail. Suddenly, the sword flared with brilliant light. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. The crystal she had touched pulsed with a strange rhythmic beat, and the entire chamber seemed to shift. A low rumbling noise filled the air, and then, with a deep, resounding sound, the stone walls of the room began to move. A hidden door slid open before them, revealing a narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch deep into the heart of the ruins. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. It worked. "Quick," she shouted to Ethan, already moving toward the tunnel. "This way, now." Ethan didn't hesitate. He followed her without a word, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. The sword's light illuminated the tunnel ahead of them, casting long shadows on the walls as they hurried down the narrow path. Lyra could hear the sounds of their pursuers echoing behind them, but she refused to look back. The tunnel was their only chance. They moved through the passage quickly, but Lyra could feel the enemy closing in. The vibrations in the ground grew stronger, more urgent. The enemy was nearly upon them. She gripped the sword tighter, willing it to give them the power they needed. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into another chamber. This one was much larger, with towering columns that reached up to the ceiling. The walls were covered in even more intricate carvings, but Lyra didn't have time to study them. She was already searching for their next move. The chamber was eerily silent for a moment, and then the sound of footsteps reached them again, closer than before. Lyra's heart pounded. They couldn't outrun them forever. She needed to find a way to stop them, and fast. Suddenly, something caught her eye. In the center of the chamber, a large stone pedestal stood, bathed in the soft glow of the sword. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know why, but she felt a powerful pull toward it, as if the pedestal itself was calling to her. Without a second thought, Lyra moved toward it. She placed the sword on the pedestal, and the moment she did, the entire room seemed to react. The air shimmered with energy, and a deep resonant hum filled the space. The sword glowed brighter, its power almost overwhelming. The ground beneath them trembled, and a massive force seemed to build around them. Lyra turned to Ethan, her voice urgent. "Stay close. Whatever happens, we have to stand our ground." Just as the enemy appeared at the edge of the chamber, the pedestal cracked open, releasing a wave of energy that surged toward them. The ancient power of the ruins, combined with the sword's might, erupted in a brilliant flash of light. Lyra held her breath, her heart racing, waiting for the storm that was about to break. The fight for survival was far from over, but in that moment, Lyra knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going down without a fight. The light from the pedestal exploded outward, bathing the entire chamber in a blinding glow. Lyra squinted against the intensity, her heart pounding. The energy from the sword surged through her, vibrating every fiber of her being. It was as if the ruins themselves were awakening, coming to life in response to the power they had unleashed. The air around them buzzed with energy, crackling like static electricity. For a moment, everything was still. The footsteps of the enemy had stopped, their presence frozen in the sudden storm of light and power. Lyra's breath came in shallow gasps, her grip still tight on the sword. She could feel its energy flowing through her, guiding her. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew that she had to be ready. The ruins, the sword, and the enemies all seemed to be drawing close to a breaking point. There was no turning back now. Ethan, standing beside her, looked just as overwhelmed. He was panting heavily, sweat running down his forehead, but there was determination in his eyes. "What now?" he asked, his voice tense. Lyra took a deep breath, glancing around the chamber. The light from the pedestal had begun to fade, but the air was still thick with energy. She could sense movement around the edges of the room, shadows shifting. The enemy had to be close. They were not going to let them escape so easily. "We stand and fight," Lyra said, her voice low but filled with certainty. "The sword, it's not just a weapon. It's a key. It's the only way to stop them." Ethan nodded, his expression serious. He didn't question her. He was ready. But Lyra knew that they would need more than just the sword to face whatever the enemy was planning. She couldn't afford to be reckless. They were dealing with forces that were far beyond what she had ever faced before. As if on cue, the shadows at the far side of the chamber shifted, and figures began to emerge from the darkness. They were tall, their faces hidden by dark helmets, their movements calculated and purposeful. They wore advanced armor, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. They were the ones hunting Ethan. They were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had him, unless Lyra could stop them first. Lyra raised the sword in front of her, the energy around it flickering and pulsing. "Stay behind me," she instructed Ethan. "Don't let them get close." The first of the enemy soldiers stepped forward, raising a weapon that crackled with energy. Lyra felt the surge of power in her chest, the sword responding to the threat. She didn't hesitate. With a swift movement, she lunged forward, the sword cutting through the air with an almost musical hum. The soldier was caught off guard, his weapon falling to the ground as he tried to block the strike. Lyra's sword met his armor with a resounding clash, and in that moment, she felt the force of the ancient power coursing through her. The soldier stumbled back, clearly disoriented. Lyra didn't give him a chance to recover. She pressed forward, her movements fluid and precise. The sword cut through the air with ease, its energy making each strike more powerful than the last. The soldier raised his weapon to defend himself, but Lyra's strike was too quick, too strong. With a final, forceful blow, she sent him flying back, his armor sparking and crackling with energy before he collapsed to the ground, unconscious. For a brief moment, silence filled the chamber. Lyra stood poised, her sword glowing brightly in her hand, her breathing steady. She had done it. She had taken down one of their enemies. But the battle was far from over. From the shadows, more soldiers appeared, their weapons raised and ready. Lyra's heart raced. She wasn't sure how many of them there were, but she could feel their energy, dark and cold, radiating from them. She knew that they wouldn't stop coming, not until they had Ethan and the sword. "We need to move," Ethan said urgently, grabbing her arm. "More are coming." Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the room for an exit. But before she could make a move, the pedestal behind them began to hum again. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the ancient power of the ruins surged once more. The chamber seemed to shift, the walls rumbling as if they were responding to the sword's power. "What's happening?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with fear. "The ruins. They're reacting to the sword," Lyra replied, her voice urgent. "It's trying to help us, but we have to act fast." Suddenly, a massive energy wave shot from the pedestal, slamming into the approaching soldiers. The force of it was overwhelming, sending them flying back with a force that shook the very foundation of the ruins. The air crackled with energy, and Lyra could feel the sword's power intensifying. It was as if the ruins were awakening to protect them, responding to the sword's call. The enemy soldiers, stunned by the blast, struggled to regain their footing. Lyra didn't wait for them to recover. With a burst of speed, she dashed forward, cutting through their ranks with swift, precise strikes. The sword moved like an extension of her own body, each swing sending shockwaves of energy through the air. Ethan moved beside her, using his own weapons to defend himself. They were a team now, an unstoppable force. Together, they fought with a ferocity that surprised even Lyra. She had never known such strength, such unity, and it was all fueled by the ancient power of the sword and the determination to protect each other. But as the last of the enemy soldiers fell to the ground, Lyra knew that this was not the end. The energy in the room was still rising, and the ruins were still alive with power. The true challenge was yet to come. They had only just begun to unlock the secrets of the ancient site, and the forces they had awakened were far more dangerous than they could have imagined. With a final glance at Ethan, Lyra knew one thing for certain. Their battle was far from over, but they would face it together. And no matter what came next, they would never back down. The sword was their key, and they would protect it and each other at all costs.